Alright, this video review of the Deviate Highlander is a supplement to the longer written review, so if you want to see more detailed photos and get more information about the bike, you can check that out on Singletracks.com. The Deviate brand was started by a pair of friends who live in the Scottish Highlands and had done a lot of mountain bike guiding together in the Maritime Alps. And the name is fitting. They certainly have deviated from the norm with this bike and their previous bike, which was a gearbox model, appropriately named Guide. This Highlander frame instead is a carbon fiber 140mm bike, and there's a 150mm link coming out soon that'll allow folks who already own it to bump up the travel in the rear by another centimeter. And up front, you can mount a 140 to 160mm fork depending on what trails you're going to ride and kind of how you want the bike to behave. The particular bike that I tested has a roughly 65-degree head tube angle with a 160mm fork. I say roughly because the geometry table on the Deviate site is calculated with a 140mm fork in mind. So that would make this size medium's 444mm reach a touch shorter, the 76-degree seat tube angle a little bit slacker, and the bike's 440mm chainstay measurement should be fairly accurate. This size medium Highlander has a 410mm seat tube, and that allows me to fit a 210mm dropper in the bike, which is, this is the first bike I've ever ridden with a dropper that long, and it feels really cool. And the bike has a fully rearward axle path, so there's no issue with the tire hitting the saddle even when it gets that low. And really that rearward axle path is one of the coolest sort of defining elements of this bike. It allows the rear tire to move backward and absorb some of the energy from impacts like the fork, keeping both wheels absorbing in a similar direction rather than fighting against the impacts they're taking. And all of that rearward motion allows the bike to maintain more momentum and, in the end, go faster. At least in really rough sections of trail. Moving on to climbing with the bike, the Highlander uses an idler pulley to virtually eliminate all pedal kickback. So while you're climbing technical sections of trail and putting power into the pedals, you won't feel the effects of the trail on the suspension in your feet. You won't have that jerking that is relatively common with a lot of other platforms. The team at Deviate said that the Highlander has roughly a 25% rate of progressivity, so riders can mount either an air-sprung or coil-sprung shock, and both are going to work super well. And this bike doesn't depend on its shock for support quite as much as a lot of bikes do in this sort of travel range, which means that you can run a little less air, fewer volume spacers, and have a more tunable rear end. And anyone using a coil will probably have an easier time finding the right spring rate without having to overspring the bike. Climbing to the top of the trail, this bike seems to have plenty of support. I haven't needed to use the lockout really at all, maybe on a paved road climb, but that's about it, and I would do that with any bike just to get there a little faster. And riders who enjoy technical climbing, I think will really appreciate the way this bike grabs on. It's got fantastic grip on the way up, and at the same time it maintains a nice ride height at sag. On descents, the Highlander is definitely a bike that people are going to say feels like it has more travel than it does, but I would argue it just deals with its travel better than some bikes with the same numbers. Between its rear axle path and nice supportive progressive suspension platform, this bike really feels composed on rough trails, similar to a bike with a lot more travel. Although you can bottom it out, it's just kind of the penalty of a mid-travel bike. And at the same time, the shock does a good job of ramping up and smoothing out that transition. When I have managed to bottom the bike out, it wasn't a harsh bang into the end of the suspension, and in fact, I didn't even know it was bottomed out until I looked at the O-ring. I've been testing this bike on trails that I normally test, larger 160mm bikes with 170mm forks, and I have been super impressed with its ability to smooth things out. It's not necessarily a playful bike, it's not a park bike. It's a bike for folks who want to ride fast. That is its obvious intention, and I would imagine the 150mm link is going to make that even more so. And the place where it really shines is in rough landings, where a lot of bikes with 140mm of travel would get bogged down and pack up and just generally kind of show their shortcomings. This bike really smooths it out. while it also maintains speed impressively. I would definitely line up to an enduro race on this bike, even with just 140 millimeters of travel, and also take it back in the backcountry and play for a week-long vacation. I mean, this is, if you had to pigeonhole it, this is a true all-mountain bike, I guess. This particular build with mud spikes and Crank Brothers pedals on weighs around 33 pounds, and the bike could definitely be built up a lot lighter with lighter casings and summer tires. And I'd say the two bikes in one game is possible with the Highlander. You could have the 140 millimeter link with the 140 fork, and then if you have a fork where you can adjust the travel internally, move it up to 160 and 150 in the rear, and have a bigger bike for the summertime. When I say the bike is not necessarily for park or jumping, I don't mean that you couldn't ride it in the bike park. You definitely could. It's just, it's not the springy, playful, go bound around kind of bike that a lot of folks might like. This bike is more for the rider who is trying to shorten their time to the bottom of the trail as much as possible. It's fast first rather than being maybe playful first, and really does an impressive job of smoothing out the trail, making corners feel really nice and fast and sticky. Between the suspension design, the shock, and the tires, this thing corners so well. It's a real nice ripper. It's super fun, slightly more playful than a longer travel bike, and it's safe to say this is the most capable 140 millimeter bike I've ridden to date. The Highlander retails for 2,699 British pounds. You can find more info on the Highlander in the full review on Singletracks.com. Thanks.